Look closely at the concept of modern Indian identity. It is not a single, unified block of stone. Under enough pressure, the monolith cracks and splinters into a highly fragmented landscape. Those internal pressures come from specific grinding forces. We have the ancient hierarchies of the caste system, deeply entrenched patriarchy, the lingering administrative ghosts of British rule, and the psychological displacement of global migration. These forces lock together, turning society into a rigid machine. This pressured landscape transforms poetry into a calculated structural intervention. Words wedge directly into the gears of that machine, forcing the rigid mechanisms of society to a sudden halt. Writers deliberately weaponize their language. They take the vocabulary used to exclude or control them and reverse its direction to expose and dismantle dominant cultural narratives. To see how this engine works, we need to examine 5 distinct poets. We will map their work through 3 specific analytical lenses: philosophical detachment, radical reappropriation, and structural paradox. Reading these texts casually misses their architecture. By applying rigorous theoretical frameworks, we can translate these poems from private expressions into precise structural maps of resistance. We start our analysis with a framework built in 1911 by the philosopher Henri Bergson. Bergson argued that human laughter is rarely a simple emotional reflex. Instead, it acts as an intellectual tool, a social corrective designed by communities to discipline behavior. This graphic illustrates his central concept. When human life loses its natural, living flexibility and stiffens into predictable routine, blind habit, or fixed ideas, it creates mechanical rigidity. We laugh when humans act like unthinking machines. Praveen Gadvi's poem Laughing Buddha maps onto this. The Buddha offers a philosophical response to a civilization trapped in repetitive ideological structures. To perceive this absurdity, Bergson requires what he calls a momentary anesthesia of the heart. The Buddha observes humanity without emotional agitation. This deep intellectual detachment allows him to see how people blindly reproduce the exact same cycles of pride and violence over and over. We see a different application of Bergson's mechanical rigidity in Nissim Ezekiel's poem The Patriot. Here, the rigidity takes the form of blind, uncritical nationalism. Ezekiel creates a speaker brimming with absolute national pride. The narrator genuinely wonders why the world refuses to adopt the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi, projecting a deeply insular worldview onto global politics. The speaker celebrates ancient Indian wisdom as something no foreigner can copy. Yet they consistently blame foreign countries for local struggles, looking past the internal realities of poverty and social inequality driving post-independence India. Ezekiel captures this mindset through exact syntax, utilizing distinct Indian English phrasing like, "I am simply not understanding." This is a highly calculated choice. By writing in authentic Indian English, Ezekiel mocks the speaker's absurd optimism, while simultaneously validating a hybrid post-colonial identity over strict British linguistic purity. Through Bergson's lens, the mechanics become clear. Gadvi's quiet irony and Ezekiel's linguistic satire both act as diagnostic tools. They isolate the specific moments where a society stops thinking critically and surrenders to mechanical habit. Our second mechanism shifts from satire to direct confrontation, the radical reappropriation of historical narratives. We see this acutely in Meena Kandasamy's poem, Ekalavya. The classical Mahabharata tells the myth of Ekalavya, a highly skilled archer denied formal training because of his lower caste. When asked for Guru Dakshina, a teacher's fee, he sacrifices his own thumb as an act of absolute obedience. Kandasamy strips away this interpretation. She reconstructs Ekalavya as the direct representative of the contemporary Dalit student, navigating the caste-based hierarchies of modern education. The severed thumb ceases to be a noble mythological offering. It represents the very real systemic denial of resources, where institutional discrimination effectively amputates a student's potential and enforces academic failure. The poem issues a clear directive. It demands the rejection of quiet, obedient victimhood. Kandasamy instructs the modern Ekalavya to refuse the sacrifice and adopt a stance of revolutionary militancy. This method of systemic reappropriation operates against patriarchy in Kamala Das's landmark poem and introduction, pivoting our focus into the confessional poetry movement. Confessional poetry emerged in the mid-20th century through pioneers like Sylvia Plath. It demanded absolute honesty, dragging the unfiltered raw truths of the private self, fears, desires, and traumas into the light. Kamala Das took this framework and anchored it in an Indian feminist reality. In Introduction, Das weaponizes the private confession, deploying it as a public political strategy to dismantle societal control. She starts by weaponizing the pronoun I to assert total agency. When critics attempt to police her expression by commanding her not to write in English, she responds simply, "The language I speak becomes mine." The poem then targets the physical policing of her body. Society commands, dress in saris, she must be wife, and be cook. These are institutional directives designed to categorize and confine her existence. Das explicitly rejects these commands. Her refusal structurally aligns with foundational feminist theories, mirroring Simone de Beauvoir's argument that gender is a socially enforced performance, heavily policed by culture, rather than a fixed biological destiny. Side by side, Kandasamy and Das overwrite the dominant cultural scripts. They take the forced silence of marginalized bodies and transform it into a militant testimony, exposing the hollow myths of meritocracy and naturalized gender. To understand our final mechanism, we turn to the literary theorist Cleanth Brooks, who established a strict axiom: the language of poetry is, essentially, the language of paradox. Brooks argued that complex, lived truths resist simple logic. They cannot be neatly categorized. They require unresolved contradictions to be accurately expressed. We can map this architectural theory directly onto Rachna Joshi's poem Leaving India, which isolates the deeply paradoxical nature of migration. Look at the visual evidence Joshi presents of her destination. North America is celebrated as clean and systematically orderly, yet the text immediately undercuts this, critiquing the environment as sterile, a landscape defined by total emotional emptiness. Compare this to her description of the abandoned homeland. India is characterized as stark and ancient. It is simultaneously described as ugly and magnificent, a chaotic reality that is historically alive. Joshi surveys the modern West and calls it a brave new naked world. It lacks the ruins, the myths, and the ghosts required to build cultural depth. This builds to the ultimate paradox at the center of the text. Geographical departure promises absolute liberation from old constraints, but the actual result is a state of permanent, inescapable psychological exile. The poem closes with a profound metaphor. The speaker realizes that despite the physical distance, 5,000 years of continuous civilization lie in wait like a doting grandparent. Joshi deliberately uses structural paradox to prove a reality that defies simple logic. You can legally and physically abandon a homeland, but the history of that homeland never abandons your consciousness. Our mapping is complete. We have traced how these poets utilize philosophical detachment, radical reappropriation, and structural paradox. Now look back at the rigid mechanical structure we started with, the grinding pressures of caste, patriarchy, and colonial memory. When subjected to rigorous poetic analysis, the gears shatter, and a living, dynamic flexibility flows through the fractures. These poets function as active architects of resistance. They use their work to dismantle the very systems they document. Their literature is a deliberate ethical force. It is engineered to strip away illusion and force a rigid society to stare directly at its own self-deceptions. Ultimately, postcolonial Indian poetry issues a clear demand to the reader. It requires us to abandon unconscious, mechanical habits and reclaim our self-awareness, our fluid hybridity, and our authentic living consciousness.